Hello and welcome to Agency Office Hours for April 2023. I'm Agency Advisor Karl Sakas, and here's a preview of the questions that I'll be answering today in Sakas & Company's Agency Office Hours. First up, Henry in Spain has a question about partnerships. We know that partnerships are a good way to grow your agency, but how do you go about identifying potential partners and building those relationships? Then, Simeon in the UK has a question about business development. Specifically, what do you do when a prospective client ghosts you? Yeah, no fun. What do you do? Turns out a lot of it is about prevention. Then we'll take a look at scope creep and options to protect your agency and even prevent scope creep in the first place. Then Steve in Pennsylvania has a question about scaling. Specifically, what are the systems and processes you need working at your agency to make scaling go more smoothly? And finally, Hardik in India has a question about scaling versus personalization. Specifically, what do you do as you scale up? How do you deliver that warm personal touch to clients even as your agency grows? If I mention your question, please be ready to join. As usual, we are recording today's agency office hours, so if you're doing one of the Q&A spots, don't share anything out loud. You don't want to become recorded. And if you're joining live, we'll get this published within 24 hours. And if you're watching the recording already, well, you are good to go. All right, well, our first question today is from Henry about partnerships. If you want to come on video and unmute. And Henry, welcome to Agency Office Hours.
Thanks so much, Karl.
So when you registered, you included a question related to partnerships and specifically around where to go about finding and partners and building partnerships. If you could elaborate a bit more on your question, and then we'll dig in to answer it.
Exactly. So quick background on where we're at as a company, because we are fairly young. We originally were a group of freelancers that started working on projects together, and at some point it kind of made sense to make it official and set it up as a proper agency. Right now we're in the process of really building out our sales cycle, building out our sales strategy, and along that I read actually an article by you, Karl, about the difference between front end, back end, and full stack agencies.
Yes.
And as one of my co-founders was anyways pushing, hey, we should, as what would be defined as more of a back end agency, we should try to push and find other agencies to help us find clients. I started that process. I think I looked at 200 something different agencies, but it became really tricky to find out what is a front end, what is a full stack, what is a back end agency. And so seeing that there was an availability to ask that question directly, I jumped on it, and well, that's how we got here.
All right, well, let's dig into that. And for everyone who's following along, we'll talk about building partnerships regardless of your agency model. And then Henry will dig into specifics around finding partnerships to send business to you as a back-end agency. So to summarize, in order to grow your agency, it helps to build partnerships. Partnerships are one of the three pillars within business development, that is marketing, one-to-many, sales, one-to-one, and partnerships about building relationships with other companies, whether that's other agencies, software platforms, or anyone else that has an interest in connecting with you, your prospective clients, and vice versa. So partnerships are something that a lot of agencies neglect. Every agency is doing some degree of self-marketing, not always a great job, but some extent. And of course, they're doing sales, but a lot aren't doing partnerships. So I'm glad, Henry, that you are focusing on that. That's very important. Now, keep in mind that your partnerships will vary depending on the type of agency you're running. And there are ultimately three agency models that I have identified. The first is what we could think of as a traditional agency model. We could think of that as a full stack agency model. They do the client-facing work, they do the fulfillment, and they tie it all together. That's the traditional model. And in a sense, it even doesn't have its own name until now, because that's just what people tend to do. But over the past several years, there's been a split into two alternate models. One of those is what I would call the front-end agency. That is where the agency is focused on the client-facing work, client strategy, account management, project management, sales, brand building, and things like that. It's very client-facing. And then the other side is a back-end agency, where the agency is focused on fulfilling the work. There's project management, there are your subject matter experts, your SMEs, which depending on your work could be designers, developers, analysts, writers, specialists in different areas. And then in that case, the back-end agency's project managers interact with the project managers at the front-end agency to actually fulfill the work. There are pros and cons to each of those models. We've shared more about that in chat or in the links in the description if you're watching the recording. But I just wanted to set the stage about front end, back end, and full stack. So you have options in different ways. Now, when it comes to finding partnerships, there are several things to keep in mind when you're trying to build partnerships. One is that partnerships are relationship based. I mean, that seems obvious, but it's worth considering. And if we think about how do we build relationships with people in our lives outside of a business setting, you likely didn't start your closest relationships with people who sent you a cold email to get things started, right? These are people that you may have met in school, that maybe have been a neighbor, maybe it was someone you worked with at some point. It was someone that you got to know over time, and you also got to know them potentially in less of a transactional way, right? Like it was the coworker down the hall, or maybe it was someone that you saw regularly at a co-working space, and you learn that they do something that matches up with you, that kind of thing. From a dating perspective, yes, there is online dating, but oftentimes people are meeting, at least historically, through family, through friend, in school, through work, that kind of deal as well. So I'm sure everyone listening here has gotten some sort of a cold pitch email about, we can provide outsourced such and such services to your firm, give us a call and it's cheap and there's often a free trial and this and that. Please don't do that if that's what you're thinking of doing. Instead, focus on how can you build relationships that aren't totally transactional, that aren't starting with just a cold email, which ultimately gets to where can you meet people and build relationships from that. Now, before I dig deeper on that, Henry, what is your reaction to that so far?
No, that makes absolute sense to me. In the end, I think that is the most effective way. Like sometimes, of course, not the most efficient way, that is.
No.
Having to go to a lot of events, shaking a lot of hands, getting to know a lot of people. But
yeah.
I absolutely agree. Ultimately, that is the way to go, to form like proper relationships.
So with all of that in mind, where do they meet up? Well, some of the same things that people will think about as you're exploring a specialization in a particular niche. What are the industry publications where people gather as readers? What are the conferences? What are the online communities where people gather? Those are probably the places you want to be. For instance, coming up in the next month is the Bureau of Digital Owner Summit conference. That'll be in New Orleans. That'll be in person. I'm speaking at that event about my work less, earn more framework to help agency owners work less and earn more. And it's 2 days long. And it's an opportunity to meet a number of people, focusing on fellow agency owners and leaders kind of thing. If someone is looking to build partnerships, that could be a good place to go. That's coming up in New Orleans in about a month, if you're watching this live. But also, of course, the Bureau in general is a good way to connect, with a catch, and this is true for any organization. You don't want to be the person who shows up the meeting and is slinging business cards to everyone. This is not a Chamber of Commerce meeting where, half the people you run into are selling life insurance or something like that. That's not ideal. When I've seen people who focus on either back-end agency services or provide services to agencies, the thing that works best is they focus on helping others first, rather than they give rather than get. And, there are a range of ways you can do that. For instance, one of the people in the Bureau focuses on outsourced recruiting services, and they are regularly sharing tips to help with recruiting. Yeah, I mean, the hope is people hire them to help with hiring, but they've realized that, the more they share, the more they secure their reputation as a helpful person who's an expert in that area, that kind of thing. So, Henry, thinking to your specific partnership and relationship building, is there any particular expertise that you could share in a community that would benefit others, which, by the way, also reinforces how you can do it for them if they want? Thoughts on potential topics or things like that?
Certainly. Like we have a strong focus on the hospitality industry. With some of my co-founders, we also run a business in the dark kitchen industry, which is what we a lot focus on building like brands within hospitality, building restaurant brands, building virtual brands. So there's a lot of knowledge we have in that sector, and I think there's also a lot of demand for that type of knowledge. So that is absolutely something that we could share and like provide value first to then sell.
And that's also a case where, a lot of hospitality is sort of a hot focus, because people are like, oh, well, if I do marketing, branding, other work in hospitality, it's like, then I can, go to restaurants and I can go to hotels, like sort of a, the fun side rather than the hard side.
It's certainly a fun industry to be in, yeah.
Yeah, and so there may be some opportunities for you to sort of save people from themselves. I occasionally see, speaking of online dating profiles where it's like, like their dream, she's like, my dream is to open a bed and breakfast.
Yeah.
And I'm like, is it? Have you worked in a hotel or a restaurant before? Like I know you like to go to a bed and breakfast. Do you want to get up at 4 a.m. to make breakfast for the random people that are staying there? I don't know. But there's some opportunities for you to sort of save people from themselves.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. And as everyone is listening, like think about what can you do to help people make better decisions, make better choices, and things like that. That would be a good thing to lead with as you plug into a community to help with partnerships. So, what else? Another thing to consider, and this is true for everyone, is if you haven't done it recently, download your LinkedIn contacts. We've shared a link on how to do that in chat. LinkedIn gives you an option. You're basically exporting your connections. And this is a good opportunity to look through all of the people that you have met over the years. And are there people that might benefit from your help, either directly or maybe who would be in a position to help others by pointing them to you and, yes, help you along the way. Keep in mind that usually the export doesn't include their email addresses, so you'll still have to either follow up with them on LinkedIn or double check what their address is, that kind of thing. But these are people that you've connected with at some point that may give you some ideas where you're like, oh, I didn't realize they worked there now. Might be a good time to catch up. Ideally, of course, you catch up before you need help from them, but, sort of you go with what you got. So Henry, questions on that so far?
No, very clear. Absolutely.
So, as we wrap up the segment about partnership, sourcing and building partnerships, keep in mind that the best partnerships tend to develop over time rather than being an overnight sort of thing. So patience is important. Certainly looking for ways to enlist, maybe not everyone on your team, not everyone's going to want to help with this, but the odds are everyone on the team has some sort of a past connection that would be helpful today. Some people are more connectors than others, things like that. But make sure everyone on the agency's team knows what you're trying to do so that they can think of people. They're like, oh, my high school friend is now doing such and such, and like that just sort of helps them piece that together, kind of thing. Keep in mind that for all of this, it usually makes sense to do some sort of a small initial engagement, whether that's doing a form of paid discovery or something else, right? That way they're making a sort of a small step commitment. Say they're doing a $10,000 project rather than a $100,000 project, or maybe an initial project rather than going straight to a retainer. Like, let people get a sense of things, right? They need to know what they're getting into. And finally, for everyone who's joining live, how do you identify potential partners for your agency? Would love to hear your thoughts. Please share in chat. How do you go about building partnerships? Would love to hear what you have to share. Well, Henry, what are your next steps from here as we conclude the segment?
Well, the straight next steps is filling up our sales pipeline, and then start out approaching, like, at the same time we're doing a little bit of a, like, well, not rebranding, but we are updating all of our social media. We're updating our website to give everything a fresh new look. So we're kind of waiting until all of that is done to then start engaging, so that when people, like, well, look us up, they will see the new content and not something that has been done in the past.
That makes sense. Like, thinking, because sometimes even if people are like, oh, we get all of our business from referrals. Well, referrals are good. Ideally, you're getting people who've never heard of you before who are finding you, kind of thing. But I like the idea of upgrading your own, how things come across. For instance, in real estate investing, there are a couple websites that have communities and things like that. And there's one that's really good, but the website looks like it's from like 1998. And so when I recommend it, I have to say it looks terrible, but the content is great. Hopefully someone saves them from that. Well, Henry, good luck on everything, and let me know how it goes. All right. Well, next up, we're going to take a look at business development. And by the way, thanks, as I see people have been joining. Let's see. Hello, Allison, Anne, Benjamin, of course, Henry, John, Katie, Molly, Tom, and others. So let's talk about business development. Here's a question from Simeon in the UK. Now, he was not able to join us live, but we're going to answer the question anyway. And here's what we're taking a look at. When it comes to sales within business development, what should you do when a prospective client ghosts you? They've engaged to some extent and they disappear on you. First, acknowledge that that's really frustrating, right? Like, that is no fun. Even as I advise agencies about how to reduce getting ghosted, I still get ghosted. Like, it never totally goes away, but there's some things you can do to reduce the odds of it happening and to handle it more effectively when it does come up. So let's take a look around prospects disappearing on you or ghosting you. And if you're joining live, by the way, my colleague Kate has shared some links in chat to help, and you'll see the highlights in the recap description below the video as well. If you want to reduce the odds of fast failure, or the odds of, let's say, if you want to reduce the odds of ghosting impacting you negatively, commit to a fast failure mindset. Fast failure is basically, in sales, if someone's not a match, figure that out as quickly as possible. Whether that's from your response to their initial inquiry, maybe that's how you handle a later stage sales call, maybe it's not doing a proposal if they're not a good fit, things like that, requiring certain people to be at the proposal presentation or review meeting, or else you won't do the meeting, kind of thing. Fast failure gives you options. It basically requires the prospective client to commit on their part before you commit as well. And I talk about a fast failure sales process. The idea is that you're going to have these potential fast failure points along the way. So in that sense, if someone ghosts you at the very beginning of the sales process, That's good from a fast failure perspective. It means you didn't overinvest in someone who wasn't truly qualified, wasn't truly ready to buy. Now, if they've disappeared after you talk about price, ideally you're talking about price fairly early in the process. If you offer productized services, you probably should publish your prices, or at least a general picture. But even if you're doing custom services, it helps to share at least a range. For instance, when I worked at one of the agencies as a director of client services, one of our most visited pages was related to iOS apps, building mobile iOS apps. And we would get a lot of inquiries from people who would say, hey, we'd like to partner on an app. That is to say, they wanted us to build it for free, and maybe we would get some money if it sold in the future. This was not a match. We were on a fee-for-service basis, that kind of thing. So we're getting all of these tire kicker, time waster inquiries. My solution was to publish the minimum for building an app. And overnight, inquiries dropped, and we only heard from people that were ready to spend the money. That's a case where leads or inquiries being lower can be a good thing if you're only hearing from qualified people. If, for instance, someone ghosts you after you share about price at the very beginning, that's good. Now, if you don't tell them about price, even as a range, until the proposal, you've probably overinvested. So if they're going to ghost, get them to ghost you early rather than late. Be careful, by the way, on how you share free advice in the sales process. For instance, recently a potential client in Australia asked me to elaborate on the specifics of the strategy I would use to help him reach his goals. I had shared a key recommendation because I knew if he disagreed with that recommendation, I wouldn't be able to help him. So I decided to intentionally share it. And then he was like, well, tell me more about that. And I said, I can't do that. That's, process-wise, when someone becomes a client, I do it. But I then was able to point him to some case studies, and, if he's to engage further, can always do some references, things like that. That said, if you give someone a free tip or a free point of advice and they ghost you after that, like they were just looking for one free tidbit, they probably weren't going to hire your agency anyway, right? If their problem was narrow enough that getting one piece of information meant they could move forward, they probably weren't going to be your biggest client anyway. So something to think about as you're sharing free advice. Finally, when it comes to reducing ghosting, and if you're watching, you're joining live, by the way, feel free to share in chat. What do you do to prevent being ghosted? Or what is your worst getting ghosted story? Like, it may be cathartic just to share that. Feel free to share it in chat. But final thing to keep in mind about reducing getting ghosted in the sales process is to watch out for surprise stakeholders on the client side. This happens when the person who contacts you turns out there are other people in the background that are involved in the process they haven't told you about. It is up to you as the salesperson at your agency or the team member who's doing sales to dig into that. Sometimes it's obvious. For instance, say a marketing manager from a client reaches out and you can see that there's a VP and there's a CMO. Well, at a minimum, the VP should be involved and potentially the CMO too, depending on how broad the work is that you're doing. On the other hand, if the CMO reaches out, there's a question about how involved is the CEO going to be? And if the CEO reaches out, right, maybe it's a smaller company or they are very focused on their marketing efforts. Is there a board? Are there outside investors? Who is going to show up later and make you change things and leave you and your client contact to clean up the mess? The technical term for this, by the way, is swoop and poop. Kind of like a seagull, they swoop in, leave some not very welcome feedback, and leave, and you have to deal with the aftermath. So, what can you do? Ghosting often happens when you aren't engaging with all of the right stakeholders at the beginning. It's okay to do an initial conversation with the first person who reaches out. Sometimes, for instance, I'll get inquiries from an agency's head of operations, where maybe they're not one of the owners of the agency, but they've been enlisted to help find someone, that kind of thing. In that case, it makes sense to have the initial conversation, but then get clear on the stakeholders and make sure that any future steps, whether that's about sharing pre-intake questionnaires with you, about having meetings, what have you, make sure the right stakeholders are involved. Otherwise, they're going to swoop and poop later, and that may end up killing the deal, where you could have avoided that at the beginning by, for instance, saying they need to be engaged in the process or else we can't move forward. Oh, they don't want to? All right, well, let us know if and when. That'll let you fast fail it. So ultimately, the solution to getting ghosted is fast failure from a sales process perspective, and then make sure to enforce it along the way. And in my case, I've delegated a lot of that to my team, where I am still the sales closer for Sakas and Company, but my colleague Diane is doing initial screening, and my colleague Kate will step in to do that, but also has built out different systems to make it all happen. Coming up, we'll take a look at scaling, and for scaling from a systems perspective and also from a personalization perspective. But first, let's talk about scope creep. Today's agency office hours is sponsored by Sakas and Company. Hi, Karl Sakas here. Specifically, our upcoming July 2023 live virtual workshop on how to stop scope creep. Now, do any of these problems sound familiar to you? Your team is struggling to deliver work on time and on budget, yet things are often late and or over budget. Oh, that's no fun. Clients regularly demand additional work without additional budget, and your team is afraid to push back because they're worried about losing the client altogether. Or maybe profits are down, and you might need to make some hard decisions about the future, where maybe you've sold the work, but it's just dragging on, and you need to get new business in, but you're struggling to get things shipped already. If any or all of those sound familiar, you might have a problem with scope creep. And here's the thing. Scope creep is a normal part of agency life. It means a client wants more help from your agency. So that, in a vacuum, is a good thing. The problem is when scope creep gets out of control and clients expect work for free, or your agency feels pressure to deliver work for free rather than getting paid for it. Now, one thing to consider, if a client asks for something that's out of scope, you can ask them and your team, and get your account managers doing this, you can ask them what I call the 7 magic words to stop scope creep. That's where a client asks for something extra and you say the 7 magic words. Would you like an estimate for that? Would you like an estimate for that? The power of those 7 magic words is that sometimes clients are like, oh, it's extra? Never mind, never mind. Other times they'll say, sure, let me know what the estimate is, and then they decide yes, no, and moving forward. And then maybe 10% of the time, the client is like, estimate? Wait, what, this isn't included? I thought it was included. And, that's not always a fun conversation, but it's better to know now the client didn't expect to pay for it than to do the work and you expected to get paid for it. Now, that's just a preview of what we'll cover in the 3-week program. It's 3 2-hour sessions, 12 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time, New York City time, 3 Wednesdays in July 2023, July 12th, 19th, and 26th. If you can't join live, we'll have recordings as well, but it's an opportunity to meet fellow agency leaders from all over the world. There's a group discount if you plan to bring your full team, and we're going to cover 3 things across each of the 3 sessions. First, we'll take a look at why is scope creep happening at your agency? Why specifically are you running into it? Then we'll take a look at how to handle scope creep when it pops up. And finally, in the 3rd session, we'll take a look at how to prevent scope creep in the future. It's good for you and your full client-facing team. Like I said, there's a group discount. Scope creep is a normal part of agency life, but that does not mean you are doomed to deal with it forever. So I hope to see you at the program in July. We've shared a link. Registration opens soon, so if it hasn't opened yet, by the time you're reviewing this, you can sign up to get notified or just go in and register. So thank you. All right. Two more questions today. One of them, both are about scaling, but the first is about systems and processes. And then the second one is related to how do you do it without, how do you scale without hurting your client experience? So let's take a look. Our next question is from Steve in Pennsylvania. Now, just got a note right before, wasn't able to make it, is under the weather, but we're going to answer the question anyway. So let's see. And you know, my colleague Kate, who's our producer, has some thoughts, especially on the hiring process. So I'm gonna bring Kate in as well. So, you know, as we think about this, to recap, if you want to scale your agency, what internal systems and processes do you need to make it all go more smoothly? Well, we can think of those systems and processes in several categories. The first one is around your business development. That includes your lead gen, includes screening, it includes partnerships. We talked earlier about partnerships. We talked earlier about screening and building a fast failure sales process. It's important as you grow that your team is able to enforce your screening criteria and also build out finding potential clients. You know, for instance, Kate, thinking about this, some things we've done, we've gone through several iterations of our CRM over the years. Initially, we're on MailChimp for a number of years, then on GetResponse. We are now in SharpSpring, which is a lot more robust than the other systems. Some of the things we've done is identify what are segments, you know, and, you know, Kate, is there anything you'd want to add as we think about segmenting in the system?
I'd say in addition to segmenting, thinking about each time that we go into a new CRM platform, ask yourself if the person who is really capable and is the one handling the day-to-day, if they weren't there, would the rest of the team know what to do? Would they know how to handle the system? Would they know how to look for, they know how to send emails, things like that. So one of the things that we really focused on when we switched platforms was making sure that we had everything documented so anyone could step into the role at any time necessary. So really thinking about having everything documented in a way that would benefit anyone at your agency.
Excellent points. And that came up recently where I was sharing feedback with a client about their sales process. I helped them with some initial work, and now we're doing a phase 2 to up level. And when they listed their different stages in their CRM, one of the stages was called cold. And this was basically people who had gone cold, who had ghosted them. And they also had inbound and things like that. One of my feedback points, this is small, but they want to scale. Cold for a lot of people would be outbound, some sort of an outbound opportunity. And my suggestion was to either rename it cold to something else, or to make sure they clarify whenever they onboard anyone new, rather than having to explain it or re-explain it every time they end up renaming the stage. So scalability means not just all of it living in your head. So business development is one of those areas where you need to fix things, get things in good shape for scaling. Another of those is around team structure. That includes adding the right next set of layers to your team. For instance, you know, Kate, you're in the midst of hiring process to bring in someone to oversee our CRM and our social media efforts. That's a new layer within the business, right? They're going to report to you rather than to me. What are some things, Kate, that we've done from a management training and leadership development perspective to better prepare you for that? I mean, I know you've managed people before, but you know, what are some things that have helped?
I think we have spoken for a while since I've started. We had a ramp up plan for my role and the expectations as the operations manager. And Karl, you have your path to becoming a better manager. You know, there's the free 30-day manager that you have, the course email series, and then there's manager tools. And then most recently I went to Grinnell Leadership, which was a very impressive experience that Karl also went to. But Karl making sure that I have the tools to be the best manager that I can be before we're hiring this new person, so that everything goes smoothly and successfully right from the beginning.
For anyone who's listening live, if you have any favorite manager training programs, please share those in chat. You can also check out my Made to Lead book. It's a pocket guide, an literal pocket guide. It'll fit in a pocket. Quick read 20, 30 minutes, and then you can always go back to it to get tips. That's especially good if you have someone who wants to become a manager and they're not sure if it's right for them. I'll do this with clients. They assign a future manager to read the book and then write a book report. And sometimes people really engage with it and identify things where they'll need to grow. Sometimes people read it and they're like, I thought I wanted to be a manager, but I don't like the actual job. They like getting paid more and they like the title. But yeah, speaking of hiring, that includes, if you want to scale, building systems and processes around hiring. You need to build, ideally, a pipeline of junior team members, including dedicating time and process-wise to train them, to coach them, and otherwise mentor them from junior to mid to senior. Several years ago, Kate Hedelston, who's an expert in managing and building engineering teams, something she shared on a podcast from Fog Creek Software was that there are two ways to get team members. You can grow them or you can steal them. At some point, you'll need to do both, but if you want to grow them, you need a process to help grow people into their new position. They're unlikely to just magically get there. Some other systems, if you want to scale, I know this is a lot of stuff. It's hard to scale, but if you have a good team, they can focus on these individual areas so you're not having to manage all of them yourself. One of those is around delivery and your lineup of services. So delivery can include a range of things, right? That include account management, project management, as well as your subject matter experts. Client strategy fits into that as well. Keep in mind, do you want to productize your services or not? It's easier to scale an agency if you do more productized services, but that's not right for everyone. Some people prefer custom services, and that's a better match. We've shared the article in chat about the different options there. Also keep in mind that, delivery-wise, it is time to make sure you're using the right project management system. There is no one right project management system. It's about finding one that is right for you and your agency, both today and the next few years, right? You're not going to pick one system that'll necessarily last forever, depending on your agency's evolving. And I've identified at this point more than 80 different PM software options. And I still hear about new ones. Agency owners will mention a new one that I haven't come across, or we'll hear from the software firm saying, hey, will you add us to the list? Kind of thing. And it's like, yeah, I want that list to be as comprehensive as possible. So up to 80 plus different options. Final thing, when it comes to your scaling and processes and systems, would be around internal reporting. Keep in mind that if there's a point where your agency was where everyone sat in one room, in a physical room, if you needed to communicate something, you just kind of yelled across the room. Well, we didn't actually yell, but you could yell if you needed to. Or if you had a question, you would just go over and ask, that kind of thing. But as your agency has grown, and especially if you've shifted fully or more virtually, remotely, distributed, you need to communicate better, and you need to change your systems for communicating. That also includes building systems for internal reporting, so you know where things stand, you know what's going on, things like that, rather than just making it up from scratch. That includes your finances. That includes assigning goals and managing goal completion. What's the status of everything, and other delegation as well. Kate, is there anything you'd add around as we think about scaling and systems and perhaps around automation that comes to mind before we move to our final segment today?
think all of those are really great points. Just making sure communication within the team is really clear. If everyone has a better understanding of what their role and how they contribute, they all are aware of your values, goals, and resources, they're all in alignment, that's going to help you scale your agency much faster than a team who's disjointed.
For sure. And keep in mind that, for everyone listening, you'll need to keep up leveling your leadership along the way. The old ways doing things probably aren't working now, and they definitely won't work in the future. So keep growing. All right, Kate, thank you for joining.
Of course.
So here's our final question for today. This is from Hardik in India. He wasn't able to join us live due to time zone difference, but we're going to answer the question anyway. Here's the question. When it comes to scaling your agency, how do you make sure that you keep the personal touch? How do you personalize the experience for your clients, even as your client count grows? It's an important question because, if you were growing without thinking from a scaling perspective, which we could look at as intentional growth rather than just growing just because, there's a risk that clients will slip through the cracks. In an extreme case of this, I worked with an agency a number of years ago where they had at one point had 100 active clients, and they were now down to 80 active clients. And the owner said, how do I get back to 100? And I said, why do you want to get to 100? He said, well, make more money. And I'm like, maybe, but that doesn't mean they'll be profitable. And indeed, they were having some profitability challenges. And the problem was that they had so many active clients that no one was paying attention to each individual client. For instance, one of their clients had cut their monthly retainer spend. The accounting department updated the invoicing process. Unfortunately, no one remembered out of the 80 clients to tell the delivery team for that was working on that client. And based on my calculations, instead of charging at the time $125 an hour, although today, this was a while ago, probably be more like $200 an hour. For that 2 months, according to my calculations, the agency was charging an average of $5 an hour for their services because the billing went down, but the team kept delivering at the old pace. Don't do that. Now, ideally, you have 10 to 20 active clients. You could go up to 30. When it's well above that, though, it gets harder. But in general, if you're adding more clients, some things to consider. Prioritize warmth and competence. This is a commitment internally to deliver 2 different aspects to your client relationships. Competence is getting the job done, right? It's helping the client grow, reach their overall goals, getting things done. That's competence. Warmth and competence. This comes from the book, The Human Brand, by Chris Malone and Susan Fisk. Chris Malone is a former Fortune 500 CMO. Susan Fisk is a psychology professor at Princeton. In The Human Brand, they look at warmth and competence. Warmth is about you make people feel special. And that applies to your interactions with your clients and your interactions with your team and vice versa. So, when it comes to warmth and competence, if you're focused solely on getting the job done, you might get the deliverables in on time. But if you struggle with warmth, maybe you inadvertently embarrass your client contact in front of their boss. So you're going to remember that a lot more than the fact that you got the deliverable done on time. So ideally, focus on both. When you focus on warmth and competence, your team knows where to dedicate their efforts and where not to, and that makes it easier to scale. Another thing to consider if you are looking to increase your agency's size as you scale is to create a client health checklist. What's on a client health checklist? Well, it's ultimately looking at each individual client relationship to see how are things going. Now, what might be on your client health checklist? Well, that'll be unique to your agency, but here are some things to consider. What was your last touch point with the client? If you use a higher level CRM, you can probably automate that, either if it's tracking things in the CRM, or you can potentially use Zapier or other automation to track that. For instance, if they're a retainer client and you haven't talked to them in 2 months, that's not good. It could also help you see if you're talking too often, but when was the last touch point? Another would be, when did you last speak with or meet with or otherwise interact with your day-to-day client contact's boss? Keep in mind that your client contact, this is for any particular account on the client side, could leave at any moment. And if they do you have a second layer of connection within the client organization? If you don't, that's not good. And that's why you want to include that on the client health checklist. If you've struggled with that before, I'm not saying you have to go out and meet with every client's boss this week, but you can start triaging and decide, all right, these clients, we're going to try to make that meeting happen this month, this group of clients the next month, and hopefully everyone by the month after that. Up to you, but it starts by knowing. And, some of it could be about clients, getting to know them personally. For instance, what is the client's birthday? You can send them a card. You can at least send them some sort of a greeting or note. People, tend to be fans of themselves. So remembering their birthday means you're a fan of them. They're a fan of their favorite person. Also, do you know anything about the client's family, about their pets, things like that? So then you can say, oh, hey, how did their child's recital go? Or how did things go, this or that? It just shows that you're getting to know them individually. Not every client's going to want to share. That's okay. But, I would guess that if you know a client's, names of family members, or at least the details, and their pet name, that doesn't guarantee that, they're having a great experience as a client. But if you don't know any of that, that probably hurts things a bit. And then the final thing as a baseline for your client health checklist to help you create a good client experience as you grow would ultimately be about what is the client's renewal date? I had a client recently who, agency, where one of their account managers was trying to get something renewed. And unfortunately, the account manager hadn't brought up the renewal until it was a 6-month contract until 2 weeks before the end of the contract. And at this point, they had, they weren't getting it renewed in time. It was not a good situation. So pay attention to renewal date. Some other things to help you create a more personalized client experience as you scale. Use your CRM for particularly looking at lead scoring. What's the client's engagement with your marketing content? That's not a perfect proxy for their engagement as a client, but if they seem to like it, that's a good sign. Also look for opportunities. Here's a way to impress your clients in terms of your attention to warmth and competence. If you come across an article that they would find interesting or they would find relevant, share it with them. Saw this, thought of you, and link the article. Here's the thing. You can share that article and you can share the think of you with multiple clients. For instance, I have several clients that do different aspects of e-commerce. If I see something major from an e-commerce perspective, I'll share that to each person individually, that kind of thing. Or for instance, with Silicon Valley Bank, their recent failure, one of the things that emerged from that is if an agency has a client that banked through Silicon Valley Bank, how is that going to impact the agency getting paid? So in that case, I reached out to clients that I knew worked with startups, my clients, to check in with them on how they were doing. And often they hadn't thought of that yet. So something that might be obvious to you isn't always going to be obvious to everyone. And certainly people would rather get 2 reminders rather than none, that kind of thing. And of course, sometimes it could be individual as well. Hopefully you have Google Alerts set up or other monitoring for all of your clients if you come across stuff. For instance, I recently saw in the local business journal, an acquaintance had been profiled in a recent award program series. And I had, I sent her a message and said, I don't know if you get the print edition, congrats on the recognition. If you don't have a print copy already, I'm glad to send you a copy. And it turned out she only had the digital subscription to where she had gotten the award. And so I was, as far as I could tell, the only person who was sending her a print version of things. So, pay attention. And final point, when it comes to delivering a personalized client experience as you scale your agency is this: focus on making your client the hero, with you as the helper. This comes from the hero's journey from Joseph Campbell. Of course, StoryBrand has applied that in a sort of marketing friendly way, but ultimately keep in mind, your client is the hero of their own story. When I previously ran a CMO networking group through a marketing association, all of my client work is solely with agencies, but through the volunteering, I was running the CMO group. I have to say, agencies did not come up a lot. I knew that everyone in the group had agencies supporting them to some extent, but for the CMO, they are the hero of their own story, and that's just fine. Your agency is there as the helper to help your clients live their heroic story, whatever that might look like. So that concludes today's agency office hours. There are a lot of challenges to running an agency. It'll never be easy, but certainly it doesn't have to be so hard. Thank you for joining us this month, and look forward to seeing you again soon. You can register for all upcoming office hours events at sakasandcompany.com, SAKASAND, the word company.com. And good luck out there.